The sound of polished leather shoes against the concrete barely echoed as Jonathan Blake crouched beside the tank. The sun was harsh overhead, but it didn't matter. Not when each breath he took was dragged through a plastic tube attached to a green and white canister labeled O2. His navy blue suit clashed with the setting. An empty plaza surrounded by glass skyscrapers, a place usually bustling with business people now silent. But what made the moment truly surreal wasn't the oxygen mask or the sharpness of his appearance. It was the row of children standing before him, 5 of them, boys aged, somewhere between 6 and 10, wearing mismatched jackets and scraped-up shoes. Jonathan looked at them like they were ghosts. He didn't speak at first, just stared at the smallest one, who had dirt on his cheek and wonder in his eyes. Then Jonathan said it. "I'm incurable." The words weren't for the children, not really. They were for himself, an echo of what he'd heard 3 weeks ago in a pristine white office where doctors never flinched when delivering death sentences. The kids didn't react the way adults did. No gasps, no looks of pity, just silence. And then the boy in the red hoodie stepped forward. "We know how to save you." Jonathan blinked. Was it a joke? A child's fantasy? Or something else entirely? No one moved. The air between them thickened with unspoken questions. In the distance, someone might have been taking a photo or filming, but Jonathan didn't care. Something about these kids, how they stood firm, how they weren't afraid of him, struck a nerve deeper than the diagnosis ever had. That morning had started like all the others since the diagnosis. A reminder alarm on his phone. 3 months left. Make it count. Jonathan hated it, but couldn't bring himself to delete it. It was the kind of thing a dying man thought might keep him honest, keep him brave. He had dressed carefully, suited up as if he still had meetings to attend, contracts to sign. It felt like muscle memory. He told himself he'd walk the city and try to feel normal, but nothing about. Carrying an oxygen tank felt normal. Pedestrians gave him space, not out of respect, but discomfort. He was a disruption in their otherwise curated routines. That was until the children showed up. He had noticed them lingering near the public fountain an hour earlier. They hadn't asked for money or food. They just watched him. At first, Jonathan thought they were waiting for someone, maybe a parent, but after 10 minutes it became clear they had no adult nearby. When he sat down to rest, too winded to continue pretending he could walk like before, they approached him, cautiously one by one. The oldest stayed at the back, eyes scanning the street like he knew what danger looked like. The youngest was bold, the one who'd spoken to him. Jonathan had expected them to ask about the tank or why he wore a nasal cannula. Instead, they asked why he looked sad. Not sick, sad. That distinction hit him like a punch. In all his meetings with doctors, lawyers, and advisors, no one had noticed his sadness, just his prognosis. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he asked one of his own, "Where are your parents?" The red hoodie boy just shrugged. "Don't got any." The answer was too casual, too resigned. Jonathan had spent a lifetime negotiating high-stakes deals, reading faces for signs of hesitation or lies. This kid wasn't lying. The others nodded, as if confirming a shared truth. Jonathan looked around, half expecting someone to accuse him of doing something wrong. After all, a rich man, in a suit surrounded by kids in ragged clothing, made for a suspicious picture. But no one intervened. The city, as always, looked away when it mattered most. One of the boys sat beside him, legs crossed, hands in his jacket pockets. "Is that thing helping you breathe?" he asked, pointing at the oxygen tank. Jonathan nodded slowly. For now, the boy stared at the tank like it was a magic artifact. "Looks heavy," Jonathan chuckled. "It is." There was a beat of silence. "You should get one with wheels," the boy said. Jonathan smirked. "Maybe I will." It was the first time he had smiled in days. Not the forced, polite smile he gave to board members or lawyers, but a real one, born out of the absurdity of the moment, the innocence of the comment, and the truth in it. Another boy, a bit older with shaggy blonde hair, pulled something from his pocket. It was a granola bar, half crushed, but unopened. He offered it to Jonathan like it was a gold bar. Jonathan hesitated. He didn't need food, but it wasn't about need. It was about kindness. He took it. "Thanks," he said, and meant it. The kid nodded and returned to his spot. No one said anything else for a minute. The moment felt sacred, in its stillness. And for the first time since his diagnosis, Jonathan felt something other than fear. He felt seen, not as a dying man, but as a person. But as always, peace was short-lived. A security guard emerged from one of the towers, walking briskly toward them. "Sir, is everything okay?" he asked, eyes flicking between Jonathan and the kids. "We've had complaints." Jonathan looked up, the smile fading. The kids tensed. "We're fine," Jonathan said calmly, "just talking." The guard didn't look convinced. "These children, are they with you?" Jonathan paused. The easy answer was no. He didn't know their names, didn't know where they came from, but something in him wouldn't allow the detachment. "They are now," he replied. The guard blinked. "Excuse me?" Jonathan stood slowly, adjusting the oxygen tank strap. "I said, they're with me." The guard hesitated, then backed off with a skeptical nod, mumbling something into his radio. Jonathan turned to the kids. "You hungry?" he asked. They looked at one another. "Always," said the red hoodie kid. Jonathan started walking toward the nearby diner, his pace slow, breath labored. The kids followed. No one asked where they were. Going, no one needed to. Something had shifted, and while Jonathan didn't fully understand why he had invited them, he knew he couldn't uninvite them now. They were in. Whatever this was, it had begun. As they walked, Jonathan kept glancing back, making sure they were still with him. He didn't know. Their stories, didn't know how long they'd been on the streets or what they'd been through, but there was something in their eyes he recognized. Survival. Not the kind that came from resources or intelligence, but the kind born from being unwanted and unseen. Jonathan had spent his life building walls to keep people out. In one afternoon, 5 children had climbed over them without effort, and now they were walking beside him, no questions asked. By the time they reached the diner, Jonathan was nearly out of breath. The waitress gave them a look, 1 part pity, 2 parts confusion. Jonathan waved her off and ordered 5 pancakes, bacon, eggs, and juice. The kids didn't wait for permission. They devoured the food like it might vanish. Jonathan watched them, something tightening in his chest. It wasn't the illness. It was something else, something more dangerous. He was beginning to care. And that was a problem, because caring meant he had something to lose again. And he wasn't sure he could handle that, not now. He reached into his pocket and silenced the reminder on his phone. 3 months left, make it count. For the first time, he questioned what that actually meant. Because maybe it wasn't about traveling or ticking off a bucket list. Maybe it was about pancakes and kids who gave away granola bars. Maybe it was about finding meaning in the wreckage. Jonathan didn't have answers. But as he watched the smallest kid share his bacon with the oldest one, he realized he might finally be asking the right questions. Jonathan Blake had built his life on certainty. Deals were numbers, and numbers didn't lie. They were clean, predictable, transactional. If something didn't add up, he walked away. But when he sat alone in his luxury apartment the day after meeting the kids, watching sunlight spill across the marble countertops, nothing about this felt like math. It felt messy, emotional, dangerous. He'd spent the night replaying the scene in his head, 5 street kids appearing like ghosts in his final months. He told himself it was a fluke, a one-time thing. But when he looked at the granola bar still on the counter, untouched, he knew better. Something had shifted. He hadn't invited them in because of guilt or pity. He had done it because, for the first time in a long while, he felt less alone. 3 weeks earlier, he was sitting in a private clinic that smelled like bleach and money, the kind of place where doctors didn't say cancer or death out loud. They talked in euphemisms, words like decline and manageability. But there was no managing this. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis was a death sentence. The doctor had tried to soften the blow. You may have 3 to 6 months, with care. Jonathan had laughed bitterly. Define care. He remembered the doctor blinking awkwardly, as if not used to people facing death without bargaining. Jonathan didn't ask for a second opinion. He didn't cry. He simply stood, shook hands, and walked out. He hadn't told anyone, not even his assistant, Grace. In the world of billionaires, illness was weakness and weakness was leverage. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Since then, his days had become carefully curated simulations of routine. Wake up, dress, read markets, eat the same protein-packed breakfast, decline calls, walk until he was winded, come back, stare at nothing. It was the closest he'd ever come to living without purpose. And yet, he told himself it was better this way, clean, quiet. He didn't want visitors or caretakers. He didn't want to die in a hospital bed surrounded by beeping machines and fake sympathy. But the moment those kids spoke to him, "We know how to save you," the plan cracked. He had let them in for a night, just one, a thank you for the honesty they offered him when no adult had. But they didn't leave, or rather, he didn't make them. The next morning he expected them to be gone. Instead he found Tyler and Mason sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, arguing over cereal. The others had disappeared at dawn, leaving only those two behind. "Where are the rest of you?" Jonathan asked, still groggy, mask over his face, tank humming beside him. Tyler looked up. "We don't know them. We just followed." Mason added, "They weren't our friends." That was the first time Jonathan realized they hadn't arrived as a group, just a coincidence. Or maybe something else. Jonathan sighed. "You need to go," he said. Tyler's response was flat. "Where?" Jonathan didn't answer. He wasn't ready to admit he had no good response. He called his assistant and told her to arrange something. "Find a shelter," he said. "2 boys, ages 7 and 9, probably." Grace didn't question him. She was used to odd requests. By noon, a driver had arrived. Jonathan handed the boys a $100 bill each. "Use this if you need to leave." They looked at it like it was play money. Tyler asked, "Will we see you again?" Jonathan paused, then said, "Probably not." He watched the car drive off, feeling lighter, for exactly 4 hours. By the time the sun set, the doorman rang up. "Mr. Blake, we have 2 minors in the lobby claiming to be your wards." Jonathan's heart sank. "Send them up." He opened the door before they could knock. They were dirty, tired, shivering. "You left," Mason said, like it was betrayal. "You said it was a shelter," Tyler added, voice trembling. "It was worse than the street." Jonathan didn't speak. He simply stepped aside. They walked in like they belonged, and somehow they did. That night, he didn't sleep. Not from the illness, but from the noise in his mind. He couldn't let them stay, but he also couldn't send them back. He called Grace again the next day. "Forget the shelter," he said. "I'm handling it." She sounded confused. "Handling what exactly?" Jonathan didn't answer. He hung up. Over the next week, the boys stayed. He bought bunk beds, groceries that weren't just vitamins and protein powders. They watched cartoons on the massive living room screen. Tyler liked nature documentaries. Mason preferred slapstick comedy. Jonathan found himself laughing too, despite himself. They asked him why he had so many rooms and no toys. He didn't know how to answer. They asked about the oxygen tank. He said, "It helps me breathe." Tyler's response was simple. "We can help too." Jonathan had never cared for children, too messy, too unpredictable, but these boys were different. Or maybe he was different now. They didn't ask for much, just attention, just safety. They were curious about everything, why his closet was color-coded, why he had framed photos with no people in them. "Those were stock images," he admitted. Mason giggled. "You framed pretend people?" Jonathan chuckled, embarrassed. "It was for the staging. I never took them down." Slowly, the apartment changed. The silence was replaced by noise, and the cold marble floors were littered with socks and shoes and signs of life. He hadn't planned for this, but plans, it turned out, didn't mean much anymore. He started asking questions. Where were their parents? How long had they been on the street? Tyler told him their mom left 2 years ago. Their dad had been gone before. That. She said she was going to get help, Tyler explained. We waited, then we stopped waiting. They had drifted through foster homes and back out again. No one wanted us both, Mason whispered. Jonathan listened, hands clenched. These weren't just street kids. They were abandoned, forgotten. Like him in a different way. They weren't looking for pity. They were looking for permanence. And suddenly, he wanted to give it to them. But a voice inside him kept screaming, "What are you doing? You're dying. You can't save them. You'll just leave them again." He couldn't ignore it, so he sat them down. "You can't stay here," he said. Tyler didn't cry. Mason didn't argue. They just looked at him, eyes hollow. "Okay," Mason said. Jonathan felt his stomach twist. "I'm not a good person," he added. "I don't know how to do this." Tyler said, "You're trying. That's more than anyone else." The words landed hard. Jonathan couldn't reply. The silence between them stretched so long he almost believed it would break something, but instead it healed a piece of him he didn't know was still open. The next day, he called a lawyer. "I need emergency guardianship," he said. 2 minors. The lawyer hesitated. "Mr. Blake, may I ask why?" Jonathan answered without thinking. "Because I don't want to die alone." The line went quiet for a beat. Then the lawyer said, "Understood." Papers were drafted, arrangements made. Tyler and Mason weren't just visitors anymore. They were his now. And as he signed the final document with trembling fingers, Jonathan realized that this messy, terrifying, beautiful choice might just be the last deal of his life worth making. Before the diagnosis, before the oxygen tanks and late-night panic attacks, before Tyler and Mason showed up and cracked his shell wide open, Jonathan Blake was the kind of man people feared in boardrooms. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just listened, paused, and then asked a single question that made everyone else realize how unprepared they were. That's who he was, methodical, sharp, and impossibly cold. If someone said no, he offered twice the price, once. If they still declined, he bought everything around them until they couldn't breathe. That was his game. He didn't make deals. He closed them. The walls of his penthouse weren't decorated with family photos, but with signed contracts and framed news articles announcing his latest acquisitions. His life was an empire built on control, and it had worked until it didn't. 8 years ago, it was different. Back then, he was married to someone who made the world less transactional. Her name was Elise, a schoolteacher with a soft voice and a spine of steel. She didn't care about the money. She drove a used car and wore second-hand shoes, even when his net worth passed 50 million. She made him laugh at things he didn't find funny. She sang off-key and left sticky notes on the fridge with dumb jokes, and she wanted kids, badly. He didn't, not at first. But Elise had a way of making things feel safe, so he agreed. They tried for 2 years. When it finally happened, she cried in his arms, and then she died 6 weeks. Later, a car ran a red light. He wasn't with her. He was in Tokyo finalizing a deal he doesn't even remember the name of now. That moment ended everything soft in him. After Elise died, something inside Jonathan calcified. He sold their house and moved into the penthouse downtown. He donated all her things, except for one photo of her holding their positive pregnancy test. He kept it in a drawer, couldn't look at it, couldn't throw it away. The baby didn't survive either. Complications from the crash. They buried Elise and the child together, a shared grave. After the funeral, he cut everyone off. Friends, family, even Elise's sister, who begged him not to disappear. He vanished into work. Work was clean. Work didn't ask questions. Work didn't grieve. And the more successful he became, the more untouchable he felt, or tried to feel. He filled the silence with money. Years passed. The name, Jonathan Blake became synonymous with ambition. Magazines called him the Ice King of Midtown. He smiled for cameras but never spoke off script. Assistants came and went. Business partners learned not to ask about his personal life. He was seen at charity events, galas, fundraisers, but only for appearance. Inside, he was empty. Every morning he would wake up and check his stocks like a man checking his own pulse. His routine was so rigid it became legend. Black coffee, protein shake, 2-hour gym session, 3 meetings before noon, and silence after 7 p.m. He liked it that way. Silence. Didn't ask why you were alone. Then came the shortness of breath, subtle at first, a flight of stairs, a jog that left him winded. He blamed it on age, on stress, but the symptoms worsened. His trainer suggested a checkup. He ignored it. His assistant scheduled it anyway. That was when the house of cards fell. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, terminal, no cure. The doctor's voice was calm, clinical. He explained it as a slow suffocation. Your lungs will harden. Less oxygen will reach your blood. You'll tire easily. Eventually, breathing will feel like drowning. Jonathan had sat in silence. Didn't flinch, didn't blink. Just asked, how long? The answer was vague. 3 months, maybe 6. Depends on your choices. Jonathan had always made choices. This one felt like none of them mattered. He didn't cry, not then, not later. Instead, he made a list. He sold 2 properties, cancelled. He 4 meetings, fired his driver, donated to the children's hospital Elise used to volunteer at, and then he disappeared. Not from the world, but from the life he'd built inside his fortress of wealth. No more press, no more strategy, just drifting, waiting, watching the days pass like receipts, until those kids appeared, and suddenly the silence became unbearable. The penthouse started to feel like a tomb. The framed contracts on the wall mocked him. What was the point of building empires if no one's there to inherit them? It wasn't just about death, it was about irrelevance. Jonathan realized in the deepest part of himself that he could die tomorrow and no one would mourn him. Not really. His investors would send flowers. His name would trend for a day, but there would be no grief, only headlines. That thought rattled him more than the diagnosis. Elise had once told him, the measure of a man isn't what he builds, but who misses him when he's gone. He had laughed at her then. Now the words haunted him, because the answer was no one, and yet 2 boys who didn't even know his name had offered him something no deal ever had, a second chance. He found himself staring at the photo again, the one of Elise smiling, holding that pregnancy test like it was gold. He hadn't touched it in years, but now it sat on his desk. Tyler had noticed it during breakfast. "Is that your wife?" he'd asked. Jonathan didn't answer, just nodded. Mason had leaned over. "She's pretty." Jonathan had forced a smile. She was. The boys didn't press. They just nodded, as if sensing the weight of silence that followed. That night, Jonathan moved the photo to the mantel. He wasn't sure why, but it felt right, like she should be part of this. Whatever this was, the routines began to change. No more morning alarms, no more obsessive stock checking. Instead, he cooked, badly but with effort. Tyler taught him how to make grilled cheese without burning it. Mason insisted on cereal for dinner sometimes. They watched movies together, sprawled on expensive furniture like it was a jungle gym. Jonathan let them. Even laughed when Mason fell asleep on his arm. These weren't things he'd planned. These weren't part of any strategy, but they were real, and they mattered more than any merger or milestone ever had. And still, the clock was ticking. Jonathan knew his time was running out. The coughing fits came more often. The tank had become an extension of him. But now the fear wasn't just about dying. It was about leaving something unfinished. Not a business deal, not a legacy, a connection. These boys had broken through his armor, and he wasn't ready to say goodbye. He didn't know what to do with that truth, so he did the only thing he could. He stayed present in the moment, and for a man who had once lived 20 steps ahead, that was the most terrifying act of all. The apartment was not built for children. That much became obvious within the first 20 minutes of having Tyler and Mason inside full-time. It was a sleek, minimalistic monument to wealth. Grey walls, marble floors, chrome fixtures. and furniture too expensive to touch. Every surface was sharp or fragile. The kind of space you'd see in a magazine but never want to live in, especially not with two boys who had never had boundaries, structure, or carpet beneath their feet. Jonathan watched in silence as Mason ran a toy car, he didn't even know where it came from, along the glass edge of a $25,000 coffee table. Tyler was opening drawers like he was casing the place, pulling out silver coasters and cufflinks, examining them with clinical curiosity. Jonathan didn't say a word. He just stood there, oxygen tank at his side, watching his fortress unravel in real time. He had told himself this arrangement was temporary, a week, maybe two, just until he figured out something more permanent. But every day, the boys dug themselves deeper into the space. They had routines now. Mason woke first and turned on the TV, volume too loud. Tyler always asked for toast with honey, but never ate. The crusts. They left socks in the hallway, toothpaste on the mirrors, fingerprints on the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jonathan told himself these things didn't bother him. He lied. They did. But what bothered him more was how he didn't want to stop them. The silence that once comforted him now felt oppressive. Their noise filled the void. Their chaos brought meaning, and that terrified him. The tipping point came one night after dinner. If you could call overcooked spaghetti and garlic bread dinner. Jonathan had actually tried, watched a recipe video twice, still managed to burn half of it. But the boys didn't care. They ate like it was Thanksgiving, and afterward they asked if they could sleep in his room, not with him, just near. Jonathan's first instinct was no, absolutely not. He needed space, boundaries. But when Mason added, "It's just quieter there," Jonathan hesitated. Quieter. That didn't make sense. His room was the quietest place in the world, but then he remembered. Quiet didn't mean peace to kids like them. Quiet meant danger. It meant waiting for something bad to happen. So he let them bring blankets and pillows to the floor. They didn't even ask for beds. Just being in the same room was enough. Jonathan lay awake that night, listening to their breathing, their whispers, their presence. He thought about Elise, about the nursery they had almost finished, about the mobile that never hung. He hadn't been ready then. He still wasn't. But these kids weren't waiting for perfect. They were surviving, and somehow they were choosing to survive next to him. That realization was more intimate than any business deal, more terrifying than any diagnosis. He turned on his side and stared at the photo of Elise on his nightstand. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered. The photo, of course, didn't respond. The next morning, Grace arrived unannounced. She had a key card he had forgotten. She stepped inside with her usual sharp heels and tighter than necessary bun, balancing her tablet and a stack of urgent contracts. "Jonathan, we need to finalize the Mirador deal." She stopped mid-sentence when Mason ran past her holding a pillow over his head, shrieking like a maniac. Tyler followed, laughing, feet bare. Grace blinked. "What the hell is happening here?" Jonathan appeared behind them, wearing a sweatshirt, an actual sweatshirt, and looked at her like someone caught sneaking cookies. "They're staying with me," he said. Grace stared. "Since when do you foster?" Jonathan shrugged. "I don't. I just do." Grace was not pleased. She didn't say it outright, but he knew the look. This wasn't just about the kids. It was about control, about the version of Jonathan Blake she had built her entire career around. "They don't belong here," she said quietly, once the boys had disappeared down the hall. "This is not sustainable. You are sick. You need to focus on yourself, your health, not charity cases." The words hit him like a slap. "They're not charity," he replied, tone cold now. "They're people." Grace's lips tightened. "That's not what I meant." But it was, and they both knew it. Later that night, Jonathan found Tyler sitting on the balcony, knees pulled to his chest. The boy didn't speak at first, just stared out at the city lights. "She didn't like us," he said finally. Jonathan sat beside him, oxygen hissing softly. "She doesn't know you," he said. Tyler didn't look away. She looked at us like we were problems. Jonathan exhaled. She's scared of what it means if I care. Tyler turned then. Do you? The question stopped. Jonathan cold. Care? He repeated. Tyler nodded. Jonathan didn't answer. He couldn't. Not honestly. Not yet. But his silence spoke louder than anything he might have said. Over the next few days, the resistance grew. Calls from business partners, legal warnings, even a visit from a Child Protective Services liaison. Anonymous complaint. Grace denied filing it, but Jonathan wasn't convinced. The boys sensed it too. They grew quieter, more careful, as if bracing for removal. Jonathan watched the shift and hated it. Hated how fast survival instincts kicked in, how they stopped asking for things, how they folded their blankets before sunrise. He realized something crucial. These boys had learned not to trust kindness. They were waiting for the moment he snapped, the moment he decided they were too much, too noisy, too present, and it gutted him. So he did something unexpected. He took them to the park. Not a private rooftop garden, not a members-only lounge, just a regular public park. They ran, screamed, climbed things they weren't supposed to. Jonathan watched from a bench, lungs aching, but heart full. Strangers gave them odd looks. Some recognized him. He didn't care. Tyler helped Mason across the monkey bars. Mason offered his juice box to another kid. And Jonathan, for once, wasn't the man with a ticking clock. He was just a guardian, a protector, a presence. And as the sun began to set, he felt something like peace. Fragile, temporary, but real. That night, Tyler left a note on Jonathan's nightstand. It was crumpled, written in red crayon. No fancy words, just 4. Thanks for not quitting. Jonathan stared at it for a long time. The handwriting was shaky, the spelling flawed, but the meaning was perfect. He folded it and placed it next to Elise's photo, 2 reminders side by side of what he'd lost and what he might still save. Jonathan had always believed in clean exits. He ended relationships with firm handshakes, sold companies without farewell emails, walked away from deals the moment they lost their edge. It was what made him powerful, his ability to detach. So when the weight of responsibility began to press against his chest, worse than the disease ever had, he reverted to what he knew: control, distance, efficiency. The boys had been living in his apartment for nearly a month now, and the rhythm of life had become dangerously comfortable. Tyler was correcting his pronunciation when reading headlines aloud. Mason was asking questions about interest rates, and Jonathan, in the middle of terminal illness, was starting to feel, God help him, hope. That's what terrified him most. Hope required stakes, and stakes meant pain when things fell apart. He made the call one morning, barely an hour after coughing up, blood into the sink. The episode had rattled him, longer than usual, harder to recover. He sat on the bathroom floor for almost 15 minutes, gasping, drenched in sweat, staring at his trembling fingers. Tyler had knocked. Mason had called his name. He told them he was fine. He wasn't. That was the moment he decided he had to get them out, for their sake, for his. He wasn't their father. He wasn't even capable of being their guardian. Not like this, not with 3 months, maybe less, left. So he called a contact, an executive at a private children's center upstate. Discreet, well-funded, safe. Just 2 boys, he said. Smart, resilient. They'll be better off there. He didn't leave a callback number. That night, he didn't tell the boys. He just acted normal, whatever normal had become. He sat with them during dinner, listened to Mason's joke about pigeons taking over the subway. He watched a sci-fi movie with Tyler, who fell asleep halfway through. He didn't tuck them in, but he hovered by the doorway longer than usual. In the morning, he told them there was a special trip planned. He even packed them lunch. The driver arrived at 10 a.m., just like scheduled. Jonathan didn't ride with them. He told them he'd meet them there later. Tyler squinted. Mason didn't say anything, but they climbed into the car, and then they were gone. The silence in the apartment afterward was unbearable. Jonathan sat on the edge of the couch. the oxygen machine hissing like it was judging him. He picked up the remote, turned on the TV, then turned it off. He went to the boys' room, Tyler's bunk still unmade, Mason's comic book open on the floor. He closed the door. The hours dragged. He expected relief. What he felt was nausea and guilt. He told himself it was necessary. Logical, clean, but by nightfall he couldn't sleep. Every creak in the apartment felt like a voice whispering, "You failed them." At 2 a.m. he got out of bed. He called the center. "Just checking in," he lied. The receptionist paused. "Sir, the children never arrived." Panic struck like a hammer. He hung up and dialed the driver. No answer. Again. Voicemail. Jonathan threw on his coat, oxygen in tow, and took the elevator down himself. He called the police. Nothing yet. He called Grace. She answered on the third ring. "I need a favor," he said, voice low. "2 boys, missing. I think they ran." She didn't question him, just said, "Send photos. I'll get people moving." Jonathan returned upstairs and pulled out the only photo they'd taken together, Tyler's birthday, a cupcake with 1 candle, and frosting on Mason's nose. He emailed it to Grace. Then he waited. And for the first time in years, he prayed. It wasn't until the following afternoon that a call came. "They're at the construction site," Grace said. "Your Midtown project. Security spotted them sleeping in a supply trailer." Jonathan didn't wait for details. He grabbed his coat, ignored the protests of his lungs, and got in. A car. The site was a skeleton of steel beams and cranes, his next big tower, his final project before the diagnosis. As the car pulled up, he saw them, huddled near a generator, dirty, exhausted. Tyler stood the moment he saw Jonathan. Mason didn't. He just looked away. Jonathan stepped out, every breath heavy, and said nothing. Tyler spoke first. We knew what you were doing." Jonathan opened his mouth, but Tyler cut him off. "We're not stupid." The security guard offered to escort them out. Jonathan waved him off. "They're with me," he said firmly. Mason finally spoke. "We weren't gonna stay where they sent us. We've been there before. They lock the doors. Lights out at 6. No one talks to you. It's like jail." Tyler added, "We thought you were different." Jonathan swallowed hard. "I thought I was too." The walk back to the car was silent. No one spoke, but when they reached the apartment, Jonathan did something he never thought he'd do. He let them keep their shoes on. He didn't make them shower. He didn't lecture. He just said, "You're not leaving again. Not unless you want to." That night, he sat them down. No lies, no false promises. "I'm dying," he said. Tyler nodded slowly, already knowing. Mason just stared. "I don't know how long I've got. Could be weeks, could be days. But if you want to stay, I want you here. Not because I pity you, not because I think I can fix anything, but because I care. And I think maybe that's enough." The boys didn't cry. Neither did he, but something passed between them. Acknowledgement, forgiveness, and maybe something like love. Not loud or poetic, just real. Jonathan spent the next morning making pancakes from a box mix. They were awful. The boys ate every bite. When Mason asked if they could paint the walls in their room, Jonathan didn't say no. When Tyler asked if they could adopt a dog someday, Jonathan said, "Maybe." It was the most honest word he could offer. Not yes, not no, just maybe. Because for the first time in a long time, maybe meant there was still time, still room, still something worth staying for. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that passed unnoticed. Overcast sky, quiet streets, no doctor appointments, no calls from lawyers. Jonathan had fallen asleep on the couch, worn out from a long coughing fit that had left him too dizzy to stand. He'd told Tyler and Mason to do whatever they want, assuming that meant cartoons or Legos or climbing furniture. What he didn't expect was for them to start organizing his storage room. It was the one area of the apartment that remained untouched, a kind of sealed vault behind a frosted glass door marked "Private." Jonathan rarely opened it. It housed boxes and memories and pieces of a life he had long since shoved out of sight. When he woke, The apartment was too quiet. That's what tipped him off. With kids, silence was never peace. It was a sign. He followed the absence of noise to the back hallway and found the storage room door ajar. He paused. In his chest, something tightened, not just from the illness, but from fear. He hadn't gone through those boxes in years. He wasn't ready to, but now it was too late. The door creaked as he pushed it open and saw them sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by opened containers, loose photographs, dusty books, and a half-broken music box. Mason looked up first, holding a picture in both hands. Tyler didn't look at him. He was staring at something in a worn leather envelope, his eyes scanning the handwritten words of a letter. Jonathan's first instinct was to get angry, to bark at them, to yell, to take everything back and stuff it into boxes again. But the words didn't come. His voice caught in his throat, not from pain, but from emotion. Tyler held up the envelope. "Is this her?" he asked. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's Elise." Mason passed the picture he was holding. It was Elise in a hospital gown, smiling wide, her hand on her belly. "She was going to have a baby?" Mason asked softly. Jonathan sat down without thinking, knees aching, breath shallow. "Yeah," he said, "she was." The boys didn't flood him with questions. They sat quietly, respectful, like they knew some griefs were too big to poke. Jonathan took the photo and stared at it for the first time in years. Elise looked radiant, glowing in a way only genuine joy could make a person glow. She had been the only person in his life who didn't care about his money, his status, or his control. She had seen the good in him long before he ever believed it existed. Losing her had been like losing the air in his lungs long before the illness had arrived. "She wanted a family," he said, "and I kept pushing it off. Too busy, too much on my plate, until one day I said, yes, and then it was all taken away." Tyler shifted closer. "Is that why you didn't want kids?" Jonathan nodded. "At first, yeah. Then it turned into a wall. I thought if I stayed alone, nothing could hurt me like that again." Mason leaned in. "But it did anyway." Jonathan let out a breath that was part laugh, part sob. "Yeah, it did anyway. They went through more boxes together. There were birthday cards she'd written in advance, just in case she ever forgot. Notes with grocery lists, love letters she'd slid into his briefcase, and a small blue knit cap, the kind meant for a newborn's head." Jonathan ran his hand across it gently, as if touching it too hard would make it vanish. "I didn't throw any of this away," he said quietly. "I just couldn't look at it." Mason opened a journal, Elise's. The cover was cracked, corners curled. Inside were pages filled with neat handwriting. One entry stopped them all. "He'll be a great father someday. He doesn't believe it yet, but I see it already." Jonathan felt his throat tighten, his vision blur. He looked at the boys and saw her hope echoed in their eyes. They didn't pity him. They didn't see him as broken. They saw him as someone worth trusting, someone worth staying with. And in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't about rescue anymore. It wasn't about giving them a home or fixing what had been broken. It was about becoming something none of them had: family. He closed the journal and stood up slowly. "Let's keep this stuff," he said. "But not in a storage room." Tyler asked, "Where then?" Jonathan looked toward the hallway. "In the open, where it belongs." That afternoon they cleared a shelf in the living room and placed the photo of Elise there, next to the note Tyler had written weeks earlier. "Thanks for quitting." Mason arranged the music box beside them, and Tyler added a little plastic dinosaur for protection. It was messy, a clash of timelines, but it felt right. Jonathan stood back and looked at it all. "She'd like this," he said. "She hated perfection." That evening, while the boys watched cartoons, Jonathan sat at his desk and wrote something he hadn't written in years. A letter. It wasn't to Elise, it was to Tyler and Mason. He didn't know if he'd ever give it to them, but writing it made something inside him settle. He told them the truth, that they had given him more peace in a few weeks than he'd felt in a decade, that no matter what came next, he didn't regret letting them in. He signed it with his name, Not Dad, not Mr. Blake, just Jonathan. It was enough. As night fell, Mason crept into the living room, blanket in hand. "Can we sleep out here tonight?" Jonathan looked at the couch, then nodded. "Sure." Tyler joined without asking. Jonathan grabbed another blanket and sat beside them. The movie played, but none of them really watched it. They were too busy existing in the stillness of that moment, in the glow of something quiet and good. When Jonathan finally closed his eyes, it wasn't because he was exhausted. It was because, for the first time in years, he felt safe. The letter came on a Wednesday. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no markings, no stamps, just a courier's signature at the bottom corner. Grace had forwarded it, adding only 2 words to her email. "Read this." Jonathan didn't open it immediately. He left it sitting on the kitchen counter while Mason argued with Tyler over the last pancake, and cartoons played in the background. But even without opening it, he knew. He'd been waiting for something like this. A part of him had almost given up, hoping it would come. Yet there it was, ordinary in appearance, but trembling with possibility. He stared at it while the kids laughed, pretending for just a minute longer that nothing in his life needed to change. He finally opened it after the boys had gone to bed. The words were straightforward. A medical facility in Switzerland had approved him for a Phase 2 clinical trial. It was experimental, dangerous, and expensive, even for him. There were side effects listed in small print that read more like a warning label than a possibility: vision loss, cardiac distress, partial paralysis. But near the end of the letter, one sentence pulled at him harder than the rest. In select cases, lung capacity has stabilized for up to 18 months. Jonathan reread it over and over. 18 months. Not a cure, not a miracle, but more time. Time he could use. Time he hadn't thought he'd get. And now, for the first time since his diagnosis, the future cracked open just enough to let a sliver of light through. He paced the living room for an hour, the letter in his hand, his breath shallow from both anxiety and exertion. The apartment was dark except for the low glow of a nightlight Mason insisted on keeping plugged in. Jonathan ran through every scenario in his mind. Switzerland meant leaving. Switzerland meant risk. But it also meant maybe living long enough to see Tyler turn 10, to see Mason start school, to have a few more mornings of burnt toast and comic books and laughter that made him forget he was dying. But what if it didn't work? What if he got worse? What if he left and never came back? Could he put them through that? Could he put himself through that? In the morning, he said nothing. He made breakfast like always, watched Tyler line up his cereal in color order, listened to Mason sing off-key to a theme song he barely knew. He kept the letter folded in his back pocket, a weight that shifted with every step. Around noon, Grace called. "Have you made a decision?" He didn't answer. "Jonathan, this trial isn't going to wait. You need to let them know by Friday." He sighed. "It's not that simple." Grace's voice turned sharp. "Yes, it is. You either want to live or you don't." He hung up. Not because she was wrong, but because she wasn't the one who had to look into 2 sets of young eyes and explain why their protector might leave. That night, he sat on the balcony with Tyler, the air cooler than usual. Tyler was watching the stars, one hand on his chin like a tiny philosopher. "Do you think people know when they're about to die?" the boy asked. Jonathan's heart sank. "Why do you ask that?" Tyler shrugged. "You've been quiet. You get quiet when something's wrong." Jonathan considered lying, but something in Tyler's voice made him stop. "I got a letter," he said. "A hospital wants to try something. It might help me breathe better, might help me stay longer." Tyler looked at him, eyes wide. "That's good, right?" Jonathan nodded slowly. "Maybe, but I'd have to leave, for a while, to another country." Tyler didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked, "Would you come back?" That was the question, wasn't it? Jonathan didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. Tyler stood up, hugged him without warning, and whispered, "You should try. We'll wait." The simplicity of the gesture nearly broke him. He sat there long, After Tyler went back inside, the words echoing in his chest, "We'll wait." As if they trusted him enough to believe he'd come back. As if they believed in a version of him he wasn't sure existed. And for the first time, the thought of surviving scared him almost as much as dying. The next day brought another kind of storm. A former business partner, Alan Greaves, had caught wind of Jonathan's illness. The man had been circling for months, waiting for Jonathan to falter, to sell, to collapse. Alan wasn't subtle. He leaked documents, threatened legal action over past deals, called investors, whispering about instability. Grace forwarded the threats, furious. "He's trying to push you out before you even leave." Jonathan wasn't surprised. That's how this world worked. Blood in the water brought sharks. But the idea of his legacy being ripped apart while he was still alive, it stung more than expected. He'd thought he was done caring. Apparently he wasn't. He tried to keep the boys shielded from it, but kids were observant. Tyler noticed the phone calls, the tension. "Is someone trying to take your stuff?" he asked. Jonathan smirked. "Something like that," Mason added. "That's not fair." Jonathan crouched down, oxygen tank beside him. "Life isn't always fair, buddy, but we deal with it." Tyler asked, "Are we going to lose this place?" Jonathan looked around the apartment. He saw the shelves they'd filled, the walls they'd marked, the memories they'd built. "Not if I can help it," he said. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it with every breath in his body. That night, the three of them sat on the floor building a Lego castle Mason had found buried in a closet. The pieces didn't fit quite right. The instructions were missing, but they built it anyway. Together, one brick at a time, and as Jonathan watched them laugh and argue over turret shapes and dragon placement, he realized something. He didn't want to leave. Not for the trial, not for anything, but he also didn't want to die with regret. The kind that eats you from the inside out. The kind that whispers you could have tried harder, reached farther, stayed longer. As the castle neared completion, Jonathan looked at both boys and said, "If I go, it won't be forever. I'll come back." Mason asked, "Promise?" Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "Promise." And in that moment, he made his decision, not out of fear, but out of hope. Not for himself, for them, for the chance to live not just longer but better. He would go, he would fight, and he would come back if it was the last thing he did. The decision had been made, the documents signed, the clinic in Zurich notified, flights scheduled. Everything was moving forward. But Jonathan didn't feel relief. He felt a strange emptiness, like a man walking toward a light he wasn't sure he wanted to reach. He hadn't told the boys the exact date. Yet, he'd been stalling. Every time he looked at them running down the hall or arguing over movie night, his chest tightened. What if something went wrong? What if he never saw them again? They trusted him now. That was the worst part. He could feel it in how Tyler leaned closer during conversations, how Mason started calling him Jay, like it was a nickname only they could use. That trust wasn't something he had earned through money or power. It was something fragile and real, and it made him feel more human than he ever had. 3 days before his flight, Grace called him in a panic. "You need to come to the office, now." Jonathan hadn't been there in weeks, and when he walked in, the tension hit him like a wall. Phones were ringing, legal teams clustered in corners. On the central screen, headlines scrolled in bold type. "Jonathan Blake unfit to lead." Another below it. "Terminal CEO faces lawsuit over concealed illness." He stared, silent. Grace handed him a folder. Inside were leaked emails, confidential documents, his medical records. "How did they get this?" he asked, voice tight. Grace's eyes darkened. Mark Carrington, his best friend, his business partner, the man who stood beside him during mergers, divorces, funerals, the man who had visited him in the hospital and said, "We'll figure this out." The betrayal was so sharp, it didn't feel real at first. Jonathan had always expected enemies to come from outside the circle, not inside it. But There it was. His friend had sold the story to the press, passed information to competitors, and filed motions to remove Jonathan as CEO on the grounds of incapacity. Grace handed him another paper. This was submitted yesterday. A motion to dissolve his controlling shares if he didn't attend the next board meeting. He's trying to erase you, she said. Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs, not from the disease, but from the weight of what that meant. Mark wasn't just ending a business partnership, he was ending 30 years of brotherhood, for power. Jonathan went home, quiet the whole, ride, unable to even feel anger. It wasn't until he walked into the apartment, saw Mason sitting on the floor drawing, that the emotion finally hit. It wasn't rage, it was sorrow. Deep, old, familiar sorrow. The kind he had buried after a lease. The kind that made your limbs feel heavy and your mouth go dry. He didn't say anything to the boys that night, didn't want to infect them with that poison, but Tyler, always too sharp, noticed. Did something bad happen? Jonathan nodded. Yeah, someone I trusted lied to me. Tyler didn't ask who. He just said, "That sucks," and patted his arm. Later, that night, while Jonathan stared at the ceiling in the dark, he heard whispers down the hall. At first he ignored it, but the murmurs didn't stop. He got up and found the boys standing just outside the door, both in pajamas, faces pale. "We heard you talking on the phone earlier," Mason said. "You're leaving soon, right?" Jonathan nodded. 3 days. Tyler stepped forward. "We don't want you to go." Jonathan sighed. "I have to." Mason's voice cracked. "But what if you don't come back?" Jonathan kneeled, oxygen tank hissing. "Then you'll still be okay. You'll be safe. Grace will make sure of it." But the boys didn't care about Grace. They cared about him, and he realized in that moment he couldn't leave things as they were. The next day, he went to Mark's office. No appointment, no warning, just walked in. Mark looked up surprised, and then immediately defensive. "You shouldn't be here." Jonathan shut the door behind him. "You leaked my medical records. You filed motions behind my back. You lied to my face." Mark didn't deny it. "You're sick, John. You're unstable. This company needs leadership, not sentiment." Jonathan walked closer, each step slow but deliberate. "You could have talked to me. We could have figured it out. But you decided to cut me out instead." Mark shrugged. "I did what needed to be done." Jonathan stared at him, finally realizing the man in front of him wasn't a friend. Maybe never had been. When Jonathan left the building, he didn't feel vindicated. He felt hollow, but as the elevator doors closed, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Grace," he said, "I'm changing the terms of the trust. If something happens to me, the boys get everything. Not just guardianship, everything." Grace didn't argue. "I'll make it happen." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't business. It was protection. If Mark wanted his legacy, he'd have to watch it go to 2 kids who had nothing, until Jonathan gave them everything. That night, Jonathan sat the boys down. "No more hiding. I'm going away for the treatment. It might work. It might not, but I've made arrangements. If I don't come back, this home is still yours. You'll be taken care of." Tyler's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. "Why do people always leave?" Jonathan reached out and held his hand. "Because sometimes we have to fight, and sometimes fighting means walking into something hard. But I'm not leaving because I don't care. I'm leaving because I do." Mason climbed into his lap without a word, just curled into him, and Jonathan let the tears come, quietly, without shame. As the apartment fell silent again, Jonathan walked to the living room and stood in front of Elise's photo. He whispered, "I think I understand now. What you saw in me, what you meant in that letter." He touched the frame, eyes glassy. "I'm going to fight, Elise. Not for the company, not for my name, for them." And behind him, 2 small shadows watched, 2 boys who had walked into his life and, without asking for permission, given him something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to keep going. The storm wasn't supposed to hit that hard. The forecast said mild winds, light rain, nothing more than background noise to the countdown Jonathan was living inside. He had one more day before leaving for Zurich. Bags were packed, instructions were printed. Grace had been by to drop off emergency documents. The boys, quiet all morning, had been drawing signs for his return party. It was their way of coping. Tyler had made a banner that said, "Hurry back," in giant block letters. Mason had glued glitter to paper stars and taped them to Jonathan's suitcase. Every time Jonathan looked at them, the ache in his chest deepened, not from the illness, but from the possibility that this might be the last day he'd ever see their faces. That afternoon, the wind changed. The city darkened prematurely. Rain came sideways against the windows, sudden and heavy. Jonathan noticed it while helping Mason. "Choose pajamas. It's just a storm," he said, trying to sound calm. Mason wasn't convinced. "Tyler said we should close the windows." Jonathan nodded. "Good idea. Can you tell him to come here when he's done?" Mason ran off, barefoot, as thunder cracked across the sky like it meant something. The lights flickered once, then held. Jonathan checked his phone. Alerts were stacking up: flood warnings, traffic closures, power grid instability. He was about to call Grace when he heard it, a loud slam from the hallway. A door left open? No. Something heavier. Something wrong. He moved as fast as he could, which wasn't fast at all. His lungs betrayed him halfway down the hall, each breath pulling harder against the machine. "Tyler!" he called out. "Mason!" No answer. Panic surged. He reached the living room. The door to the balcony was wide open, curtains whipping in the wind like frantic hands. Rain poured in, papers scattered across the floor, and then he saw it, the dog, a mutt, small and trembling, crouched on the edge of the balcony. Mason's voice echoed from outside. "We almost got him!" Jonathan stumbled forward, heart in his throat. They had gone after the stray, the one they'd been feeding scraps to in secret, the one Mason had named Lucky. Outside, the wind was stronger than it should have been. Debris swirled in tight circles. The boys were crouched near the far corner of the balcony, coaxing the dog forward with pieces of sandwich. Jonathan didn't think. He moved, stepping out into the storm, rain plastering his shirt to his back instantly. "Get inside," he shouted. The wind almost stole the words. Tyler looked up. "We're trying." Mason reached for the dog, who darted just beyond his fingers. Jonathan took a step forward and collapsed. His knees buckled under him, oxygen tank tipping to the side. Pain stabbed his chest like a knife. He gasped, tried to call out again, but nothing came. Just a wheeze, a cruel, suffocating silence. Tyler was the first to react. "He's down!" he screamed. Mason dropped the sandwich, ran to Jonathan's side. "Hold on, Jay, hold on." Jonathan tried to speak, but his lips barely moved. The storm blurred around him. Lights flickered again inside. The city howled. Mason grabbed the tank, struggled to lift it. Tyler tried to help him sit up. "Don't move him," Mason shouted. "He needs air." Jonathan looked at them through fogged vision. They were so small, so brave. He wanted to tell them to run, to leave him, but he couldn't form the words. Inside the apartment, the power finally cut. Everything went black. Emergency lights along the baseboards flicked on in dull red. Tyler fumbled with the tank valve. Mason pressed the mask against Jonathan's face, his hands trembling. "Breathe," he whispered. "Please breathe." Jonathan coughed, violent, deep, but air flowed again, barely. "Enough." He blinked, focused, grabbed Mason's wrist. "Inside," he mouthed. "Now!" Mason nodded, eyes wide with terror. Together, the boys pulled him inch by inch across the wet floor into the living room. The dog followed, tail between its legs, whimpering. Once they were inside, Tyler slammed the balcony door shut. Mason dropped to the floor, panting. Jonathan lay on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, rainwater dripping from his hair. It took nearly 20 minutes for Jonathan to catch his breath. He lay there, the boys on either side, not speaking, not crying, just waiting. Every breath was work, but he was alive. Somehow, he was alive. "You idiots!" he rasped finally, half laughing, half crying. "You chased a dog." Into a hurricane, Tyler grinned. We named him Lucky. Jonathan wheezed a laugh. He better be. Mason curled against him, small and warm and shivering. We thought we lost you, he whispered. Jonathan wrapped his arm around both of them. Not yet, he said. Not today. When the power returned, the apartment was a wreck. Soaked floors, mud everywhere, broken glass. Jonathan sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The dog curled at his feet, and the boys passed out beside him. Grace called again. You still flying out tomorrow? Jonathan stared at the chaos around him. Yes, he said, but everything's changed. Grace didn't ask how. She just said, I'll be there at 8. Jonathan hung up, leaned his head back and closed his eyes. His body ached, his lungs burned, but his heart felt stronger than it had in years. The next morning the sky was clear, blue, clean, as if the storm had never happened. Jonathan stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, watching the boys sleep. He didn't want to leave, not after last night, but now he had a reason to come back. He kissed their foreheads gently, one by one, left a note on the counter. Don't chase dogs into storms and keep Lucky out of my bed. Then he walked out the door, lungs burning, heart full, holding on to one truth louder than all the fear. He had to survive. For them. Switzerland was quiet, too quiet. The clinic was tucked into the mountains like a secret, its white walls sterile and its staff overly polite. Jonathan hated every inch of it. He hated the way the nurses smiled at him like he was already halfway gone. He hated the soft jazz in the waiting areas, the perfectly folded blankets, the way time stretched like a funeral march between injections and scans. But most of all, he hated how far away it was from home, from them. Every second felt like distance measured in more than miles. It felt like being buried alive one day at a time, with no guarantee. He'd claw his way back out, and yet he endured it. For them, every needle, every side effect, every blackout and fever dream, he endured because he had promised. The treatment was brutal. The first 2 weeks broke him, fevers that melted hours, hallucinations, blood in places it shouldn't be. He lost weight fast. His skin paled. He couldn't eat, couldn't walk without support. The doctors told him this was normal. Your body is resisting the recalibration, they said. Like it was a computer being rebooted, not a man dying. Jonathan didn't care about the science. All he cared about was breathing, just enough to get one more phone call with the boys. Grace had installed a video line between the clinic and the apartment. Every night, like clockwork, they appeared on the screen. Mason with his stuffed dog, Tyler with his checklist of questions. What's your oxygen level today? Did you eat? Did you fight any Swiss bears? Those calls were the only things keeping him tethered to reality. One night, after a particularly bad seizure, Jonathan almost told them goodbye. He stared at the blinking camera light and opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He looked at their faces, lit by a warm New York lamp, and saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Belief. They believed he was coming back. They didn't doubt it. And that belief did something inside him. It hardened his resolve. He stopped asking how long the treatment would take. He stopped checking the calendar. Instead, he made himself a deal. Survive. Just that. No matter the cost. Survive. Not because the doctors told him he could, but because they needed him to. Week 5 brought change. The coughing reduced. The oxygen levels held steady. Jonathan stood without support. Then he walked, slowly, then faster. One morning he made it to the end of the corridor without the tank. The nurses clapped. The doctors said things like unprecedented recovery and candidate for remission status. Jonathan didn't care about the medical lingo. All he cared about was packing, going home. The flight was scheduled. Grace booked it. The boys didn't know. He wanted to surprise them. It was selfish, but he wanted to see their faces the moment they saw his. The return wasn't grand. No camera crews, no headlines, just a black car and a quiet elevator ride. He stepped out into the hallway of his apartment. building, heart pounding like a drum. Tyler opened the door before he even knocked. His eyes went wide, his mouth dropped, and he stood frozen. "Jay?" Jonathan smiled, weaker than before, but still standing. "You expecting someone else?" Mason screamed from the living room. "He's back!" Suddenly, they were both on him, hugging, clinging, crying without shame. Jonathan dropped the bag, held them both, and let himself sob. Not because he was still weak, but because he had made it. Somehow, against the odds, he had made it back to them. The days that followed were slow and sacred. Recovery wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Tyler insisted on timing his walks through the apartment. Mason created doctor charts with crayon. Jonathan didn't stop them. He let them care for him, guide him. For a man who once ruled boardrooms, being led by two small boys felt more real than any power he'd ever known. They had saved him in more ways than the treatment ever could, and now, finally, he could see it. His future wasn't a clock ticking towards zero. It was these moments, one after the other, building something new. One morning, Jonathan sat with Grace in the kitchen. She had flown in to check on him, but mostly she just wanted to see it with her own eyes. "You look like hell," she said. He grinned. "Better than a casket." She nodded toward the living room, where the boys were wrestling on the rug. "You're different." He followed her gaze. "I had to choose," he said quietly, "who I wanted to be. The man who built towers or the man who stayed." Grace sipped her coffee. "You chose right." Jonathan nodded. "Yeah, I did." Later that week they went to the cemetery. Elise's grave. Tyler carried flowers. Mason held Jonathan's hand. The headstone was simple, just her name and the year. Jonathan crouched, knees aching, breath steady. "I brought them," he whispered. "I hope that's okay." The boys stayed silent. Jonathan placed the flowers gently, then leaned forward. "You were right, about everything. I wasn't ready then, but I am now." He looked up at the sky. "Thank you for seeing it before I could." When they left, the wind was warm. The air was full of spring, and Jonathan felt for the first time in years that he wasn't walking away from something, but toward it. Back home, the three of them sat on the couch, Lucky curled up at their feet. The TV played quietly, but no one was watching. Mason fell asleep first, then Tyler. Jonathan stayed awake, arms around both of them, watching the room settle into stillness. He thought about legacy, about business, about everything he used to value, and none of it mattered, not anymore. All that mattered was this, the quiet, the warmth, the family they had become. He didn't need to be remembered as a millionaire, a mogul, or a survivor. He just wanted to be remembered by them, as someone who stayed. He stood, slowly, carried Mason to bed, then Tyler. He tucked them in, turned off the lights. Then he walked to his desk, opened a new journal, and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. "I thought I needed time. Turns out I just needed them." He closed the book, exhaled deeply, and smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because for once, everything was real. Hi, I'm Erlen, and I'm the host of Emotional Journey. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And most importantly, send this video to someone who needs to see it. You never know who might need a story like this today. Thanks for watching. See you on the next journey.